The ramp drops at Omaha. June 6, 1944, off Omaha Beach, Normandy. The channel is a heaving sheet of grey-green steel and the wind tastes like diesel and cordite as a 36-foot landing craft bucks in the chop, its plywood sides trembling with each slap of water while a sailor at the tiller fights to keep the bow pointed straight into the smoke. Inside the boat, an army platoon sits knee to knee in wet gear, helmets knocked by the motion, rifles held high, faces washed pale by sea spray and the hard white glare of explosions inland, because the beach ahead is not sand so much as a wall of noise. Machine gun bursts like ripping canvas, artillery thumps that travel through the hull, and the constant snapping hiss of rounds striking the water around them. The sailors' eyes keep flicking from the surf line to the simple mechanism in front, metal ramp, cables, locking pins, because the whole plan of D-Day at this level, the plan that exists below maps and admirals, is brutally small. Run the boat up onto an open beach, drop the ramp, and empty men and vehicles fast enough that the next wave can land before the first wave is annihilated. The boat's flat bottom skims in, shallow draft and stubborn, and for a heartbeat the coxswain can't even see the sand through smoke, only flashes and silhouettes, but he feels the keel grind as the craft smashes onto the beach and the world seems to stop. Then he yells and the ramp goes down, clanging hard, and the front of the boat becomes a doorway into gunfire. Boots splashing, men stumbling, a jeep engine coughing as it tries to surge forward, bodies funneling through the opening because there is no other way out that doesn't require climbing over high sides under fire. In that instant, you understand why this simple ramp isn't a convenience, but a survival mechanism, because every second spent clambering up and over the gunnels would be seconds spent as a standing target, and speed here is the only armor the infantry has. The craft itself is a workhorse, designed to ferry roughly a platoon of around 36 men or a jeep and a smaller team, fast enough to make the run, rugged enough to take rough handling, simple enough to be built by the thousands, and as the ramp clatters and the boat backs off into the surf to pick up more, it leaves behind not just soldiers, but a clue to the real scale of this invasion. The miracle isn't one heroic landing craft, it's the fact that hundreds and then thousands of them can do this in parallel, across multiple beaches, under fire, hour after hour. The landing craft backs away from Omaha with its ramp still dripping, engine hammering as it disappears into smoke. And the story snaps backward across the Atlantic to New Orleans, May 26, 1941, where floodlights shimmer on Lake Pontchartrain and a boxy prototype noses toward a test pier like it knows it's being judged. Andrew Jackson Higgins watches Navy and Marine observers step close with clipboards, and he can feel the old friction in the air. The bureau men who think civilians build toys, the Marines who keep asking for a boat that can hit an open beach and unload fast, and Higgins in the middle, impatient with anyone who speaks in maybe, when war is already eating the world. His starting point had been a workboat, the Eureka, built for swamps and marshes, shallow draft, tough hull, a shape that could run up toward a shoreline without destroying its own propeller. And that blunt practicality is exactly what caught the Marines' attention when they tested it against Navy designs in 1938 and 1939, because the Eureka simply did the job better, even if the offloading method was still wrong. Men had to spill over the sides, exposing themselves and wasting seconds that would become casualties under real fire. The bold idea Higgins is about to prove tonight isn't really a new engine or a miracle material. It's a door, a ramp, a way to turn the bow into an exit so troops don't have to climb and fumble. The seed had come from intelligence and observation, not inspiration alone. Marine and Navy observers had seen Japanese ramp-bowed landing craft in China years earlier, and the image, vehicles rolling straight out the front instead of being manhandled over gunnels, stuck in the mind of officers who understood amphibious war was going to be the future. When that picture made its way to Higgins, later associated with Marine officer Victor Brute Krulak's push, Higgins didn't file it away for a committee meeting. He called his engineers and told them to build it fast and test it on the same water where his civilian boats had been born. Now, under the Pontchartrain lights, The ramped craft comes in, bumps the shore, and the steel ramp drops with a hard metallic clank that sounds like a promise. A truck rolls forward, slow at first, then committed, tires biting sand as it exits through the bow, and behind it, men move in a tight stream, not climbing, not hesitating, simply flowing out and away the way they will one day flow onto hostile beaches. The observers time it, watch it, and, most important, see it happen without drama, because the whole point of the ramp is that it removes drama from the most dangerous moment of ship-to-shore movement. Higgins stands back, jaw tight, and you can almost hear what he's thinking. You can argue about tactics later, but you cannot argue with a mechanism that cuts exposure time. The craft that emerges from this crucible will be standardized and renamed as the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, the LCVP, roughly 36 feet long, shallow enough to grind onto a beach, carrying about 36 fully equipped troops, or a jeep and a smaller squad, with plywood sides to save weight and steel, and a bow ramp built to drop quickly so the load can be dumped and the boat can back off and run again. It is not glamorous, and it is not safe in the way a battleship is safe, but it is repeatable, and repeatability is what wins amphibious war. From here, the story becomes an industrial battle as much as a naval one. Higgins Industries expands from boatyard scale to something that feels like a city of production. Workers moving through shifts amid stacked lumber, jigs, rivet guns, engines, and ramps, each hull taking shape not as a hand-built curiosity, but as a unit in a flow. The numbers climb into the tens of thousands, more than 23,000 LCVPs built during the war, by Higgins and licensed builders, because a single ramped boat doesn't make D-Day possible, but thousands of them make it feasible, turning beaches into temporary ports when real ports are mined, fortified, or destroyed. And that is why, when Eisenhower later talks about the invasion, he doesn't praise a single gun or a single general in that line. He points to Higgins and the LCVP, saying that without those boats, the Allies couldn't have landed over an open beach, that the whole strategy would have been different, because Overlord isn't only a story of courage under fire, it's a story of volume, of getting men and vehicles onto sand fast enough that the next wave has a place to land. Back on June 6, 1944, that truth is not spoken in quotes or memoirs. It's felt in the seconds between the keel grinding onto sand and the ramp slamming down, in the tiny mechanical interval where a boat builder's simple idea becomes the difference between a crowded target and a moving assault. And as the Higgins craft turns back into the smoke to fetch another load, the sound of its engine is less like a motor and more like a metronome for the invasion itself. Hit, drop, unload, reverse, repeat, again and again until a beachhead exists. November 20th, 1943, Betio Island, Tarawa. Atoll. Dawn breaks hot and hard over a lagoon that looks deceptively calm. Turquoise water hiding a cruel obstacle the planners knew about but couldn't fully tame, the reef. And as a line of landing craft motors in behind the first waves of tracked amphibians, the Marines inside the boats can already smell smoke and wet coral, can already hear the island's defenses waking up in sharp, metallic bursts. A coxswain in a Higgins-built craft, one of the bow-ramped boats the fleet now simply calls Higgins boats, whether the plate says Higgins or a license yard, keeps one hand on the throttle and one on the ramp release, eyes flicking between the water ahead and the chaos on the horizon, where naval gunfire has lifted and Japanese machine guns have started to stitch the surf line, because on Tarawa, the margin between landing and slaughter is measured in seconds and yards, and the reef turns those yards into a nightmare. The craft's shallow draft is a gift until it isn't. She can ride in close, but when the keel touches coral, the boat shudders and stops as if something has grabbed it by the ankles, the engine straining while bullets begin to crack against the bow and slap the water around them. The coxswain knows the rule. If you're stuck, you're a target. Yet he also knows that keeping men bottled up inside a craft is worse, so he does the thing Higgins built into this war. He drops the ramp anyway, a heavy metal door clanging down into knee-deep water that instantly turns into a doorway of exposure, and Marines spill out with packs and rifles held high, boots finding coral and then losing it, some men stumbling forward, others going down as the lagoon suddenly becomes a killing field. The ramp does not make Tarawa easy, nothing could, but it makes the transition from trapped in a box under fire to moving toward cover brutally fast. And that speed is the only mercy the design can offer when the approach is wrong. Nearby, other boats grind onto the reef and do the same. Ramps down, men out, because climbing over gunnels in this kind of fire would be suicidal, and you can feel the design's purpose in the ugliest possible setting. The ramp is not about convenience, it's about emptying the craft before the craft becomes a coffin. The coxswain watches his load disappear into smoke and spray, then hauls on the engine again, trying to back off, trying to survive long enough to run another trip, because that is the landing craft's war. Repeat the approach into danger, drop the ramp, dump the load, retreat if you can, and do it until either the beachhead exists or you don't. In the lagoon, you can see how amphibious warfare is a chain where every link hurts. Naval gunfire, air support, timing, tides, reefs, resistance, and a simple piece of engineering can't fix the whole chain, but it can strengthen one link enough to keep the chain from snapping entirely. On the horizon, a larger landing craft, an LCM, the heavier cousin designed to carry a tank, rumbles in behind the infantry boats, its ramp dropping to let a Sherman roll forward, and the sight is both inspiring and terrifying, because tanks are salvation once they're ashore and targets while they're crossing open water. Tarawa becomes a lesson written in blood about tides, intelligence, and reefs, but it also becomes a validation of the ramped boat concept on the cruelest terms. When the approach goes wrong, you still need a way to unload quickly, and quick unloading is what the ramp does better than any elegant naval theory. Far from Tarawa in New Orleans, the noise of the lagoon is replaced by the noise of production: saws, hammers, riveting, engines being mounted. Yet the connection is direct, because every boat that drops a ramp under fire on a Pacific reef started as lumber and steel in a yard where workers are building not a single craft, but an inventory of chances. Higgins's operation is no longer a quirky boat builder's shop. It's a wartime organism, hiring and training by the thousands, turning raw material into standardized hulls at a tempo that matches the war's appetite, and the management style is as blunt as the boats. Solve the problem, build the fix, ship it, repeat. The ramp itself, simple in concept, complex in the way all simple wartime mechanisms become, once you demand reliability, speed, and mass, must work in salt water, sand, and under abuse. Its hinges and cables taking punishment that peacetime boat builders would never accept, because the ramp is not a showroom feature, it's a moving part that has to function when a frightened sailor's hands are shaking and bullets are snapping overhead. By 1944, the ramped craft is not an experiment, but a doctrine, integrated into how the US Navy and Marines think about assault landings, used not only for men but for jeeps, ammunition, radios, and the endless supplies that keep a beachhead alive. The Pacific is proving, island by island, that you can't always capture a port intact, that you may have to build a port out of nothing but ramps and repetition. And that idea will echo forward into Europe, where the Atlantic Wall waits behind mined beaches and demolished harbors. The coxswain at Tarawa doesn't know the future, doesn't know the names of beaches in France or the dates on maps. He only knows the present. Water up to his calves, the ramp already raised again as he tries to pull off the reef, the taste of smoke in the air, and the sick understanding that he may have to make this run again before the day ends. He glances once toward Betio and sees the shoreline flicker with tracer fire and explosions. And the thought that crosses his mind is not about Andrew Higgins or industrial policy, but about a piece of metal hanging off the bow that turns a boat into an exit. And he realizes, in the most brutal way, that war is sometimes decided by who can open a door faster. Later, back in the yards and offices, men will argue about which innovation made an invasion possible. But in this lagoon, with the ramp down and men moving, the argument doesn't exist. There is only the mechanism doing what it was built to do, buying a few seconds of motion in a place where seconds decide whether anyone reaches the beach at all. February 14th, 1944, New Orleans, Louisiana. Before dawn, the city air is cool and damp and smells faintly of river mud and oil. And along the industrial edges of town, Higgins' yards are already alive with noise, saws biting into lumber, pneumatic tools chattering, men shouting measurements over the clang of steel, because the war has turned boat building into a tempo problem, a race against oceans, an inside plant number. 2. A riveter named Lily Mae Broussard, hands calloused, hair pinned up under a scarf, leans into her work while a foreman's clipboard bobs past, counting output like it's ammunition. The landing craft in front of her is not a prototype anymore. It's a unit in a stream. Frames, plywood panels, ramp fittings, engine mounts. Each step simplified until untrained hands can learn it fast. Because Higgins has expanded from a tiny operation into a sprawling system of multiple plants and tens of thousands of workers by mid-war, hiring anyone who can be trained and pushed into the rhythm, including a workforce in New Orleans that contemporaries noted for being unusually integrated for the era, men and women, black and white, shoulder to shoulder, because the contract deadlines do not care about local customs. Lily Mae hears the ramp assemblies clank as they're tested, down, up, latch, over and over until the motion is muscle memory for the mechanics, and later for the coxswains who will drop them under fire, and the simplicity is the genius. The bow becomes a door, the boat becomes a moving ramp, and the war becomes a logistics equation where you can land over an open beach if, and only if, you can do it at scale. In a small office nearby, a Navy inspector runs his hand along a hinge line and signs a sheet. Because what is leaving New Orleans isn't a handful of special craft, it's a flood. More than 23,000 LCVPs built during the war by Higgins and licensed producers, each one designed to carry roughly a platoon of about 36 troops or a jeep and supplies, each one cheap enough and rugged enough to be risked again and again in surf and shellfire. The idea of the ramp, once just an argument in meetings, has already spread into doctrine, and some of the men who pushed it feel the vindication in their bones. Marine Lieutenant Victor Krulak had seen Japanese ramp-bowed craft in China before America entered the war, and those photographs and observations helped crystallize what the Marines needed, a way to avoid exposing troops by making them climb out over the sides. Higgins took the hint and turned it into machinery, and now that machinery is being hammered out by the thousands, a civilian solution to a military problem that is about seconds under fire. Outside on the water, a finished craft noses out for trials, and when the ramp drops with that hard final clang, Lily Mae doesn't hear Omaha or Tarawa. She hears workmanship, a mechanism that must not fail when a boat is hung up on coral or a beach is swept by MG-42 fire, because the ramp's promise is not easy, it's fast, and fast is what keeps men from dying inside a box. By the time the craft is shipped out, it is already part of a war that is rolling forward in steps. North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, each operation teaching the same lesson in different accents. Ports will be wrecked or defended, beaches will be mined, surf will be rough, and the only way to keep momentum is to land anyway, unload anyway, keep the flow moving as if the sea itself is a conveyor belt. Spring, 1944, Slapton Sands, England. The cold wind off the water cuts through greatcoats as American soldiers practice loading and unloading under shouted commands. And the Higgins boats, bow ramps down, men running, jeeps grinding forward, turn rehearsal into something that looks almost routine, except the officers watching know exactly what routine will cost on the real day. The boats slam onto the shingle with a violence that makes teeth click, then reverse off under their own power, turning around for another run. Because D-Day isn't a single landing, it's an industrial process performed under fire, a timed sequence where the beaches must be fed with men, radios, ammunition, engineers, and vehicles quickly enough that German artillery can't isolate the first wave and cut it to pieces. And if you step into the coxswain's position during rehearsal, you can feel how the ramp idea changes everything. You don't have to waste precious seconds with men climbing and tumbling over gunnels. You drop the bow, and the boat becomes an exit lane, a moving mouth that spits out a platoon and backs away before the next shell lands. On June 6, 1944, that rehearsal becomes reality at Utah and Omaha, where thousands of soldiers and their gear come ashore in Higgins boats, and the ramp is no longer a clever feature. It is the only way to empty a craft fast enough to keep the invasion from choking on its own congestion. Years later, Eisenhower will put words to what the men at Slapton and Omaha only felt, telling historian Stephen Ambrose that if Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, the Allies never would have landed over an open beach, and the whole strategy would have been different. But on the day itself, nobody is quoting anyone. They're just watching ramp after ramp slam down through smoke, boats grinding in and out like pistons, and realizing that D-Day is being carried on the back of a boat builder's insistence that the bow should open. June 6, 1944, mid-morning, off Utah Beach. The sea is crowded with craft moving in every direction like a living machine, and Lieutenant J.G. Walter Walt Dennison, U.S. Navy coxswain, hands raw from salt water and rope, guides his LCVP through a maze of wakes while smoke drifts low over the surf line and the distant rumble of naval guns rolls like thunder behind a curtain. His boat is scarred already, splinters in the plywood, a dented ramp edge where it kissed a hidden obstacle, and his instructions are brutally simple. Keep the cycle moving, because the invasion isn't won by one dramatic landing, it's won by never letting the beach starve. He throttles forward toward a line of colored panels and signal flags that mark the approach lanes, the shoreline ahead crowded with obstacles and men, and the moment his keel grinds onto sand, he yells and the ramp drops, clanging down into shallow surf as infantry pour out and a jeep lurches forward, wheels spinning, because everything here is about unloading before German guns can find a stationary target. On Omaha, that same cycle is being punished more brutally. Boats smashed, men pinned, ramps dropping, into water that churns with bullets. Yet even there, the logic is unchanged. The only way to keep assault momentum is to keep the ramps dropping. Because if you pause, you create a pile-up in the surf, and a pile-up becomes a slaughter. Dennison backs off fast, ramp up, engines straining as he turns into the chop, and already he's scanning for the next load. Ammo crates, radio sets, engineers with Bangalore torpedoes, medics with stretchers. Because once the first infantry wave is ashore, the beachhead's life depends on an unglamorous flood of supplies, and a ramped boat is a delivery system that can function even when ports are useless. Farther out, larger landing craft, LCMS and LCTS, are bringing in tanks and bulldozers, and the entire scene begins to resemble the industrial logic Higgins mastered in New Orleans. Repetition, throughput, standardization, a process that continues even as shells fall. A German artillery round lands close offshore, throwing water high, rocking Dennison's craft. And he instinctively ducks even though it's pointless because the boat is thin-skinned and he knows it, yet he also knows the point is not to be invulnerable. It's to be fast, to minimize the time you're exposed as a stationary target. He takes a new load and drives back in. And when the ramp drops again, he catches a glimpse of the beach beyond. Engineers already clearing lanes, naval beach parties directing traffic, wounded men being dragged behind small dunes, and he understands the invasion is turning the coastline into a temporary port built out of bodies and ramps. By afternoon, the cycle is relentless. Boats coming in with men and gear and leaving with wounded, the ramp serving as an entryway in one direction and an evacuation chute in the other, because amphibious war is not just assault, it's sustainment. And sustainment is where tempo decides whether the foothold becomes a breakout. In the days that follow, the same craft types keep working, day and night, bringing in ammunition, fuel, rations, bridging gear, and even artillery pieces, making the beachhead deeper and more resilient until the Allies can push inland and seize real harbors. But the first crucial window, those early hours when a beach could have been sealed off and drowned in blood, is survived in part because the ramped boats allow men and machines to exit quickly, and because there are so many of them that losses, terrible as they are, don't stop the flow. And while the headlines will belong to generals and beaches, the invisible backbone is still that New Orleans production logic. If you can mass produce a craft that can smash onto sand and open its own door, you can turn an ocean crossing into a supply line. The war's next amphibious operations will prove it again. Southern France, the push up the Pacific, the Philippines, each landing relying on the same brutal arithmetic of volume and speed, because every beach is a bottleneck, and every bottleneck is an opportunity for the defender to kill you, unless you can flood it. Denison, exhausted, keeps running loads until his arms ache and his throat is raw from shouting. And when night falls, the sea doesn't quiet so much as change tempo. Fewer flashes, more navigation lights masked, the steady cough of engines and the slap of waves against plywood and steel, because the invasion continues even in darkness, and the Higgins boat, simple and stubborn, keeps doing what it was built to do: hit the beach, drop a ramp, unload, reverse, repeat, again and again, until D-Day is no longer a single day, but a permanent fact on the map. October 20th, 1944. Red Beach, Leyte. Gulf, Philippines. The tropical air is thick and sweet with rot and smoke, and the surf line is a froth of tan water as LCVPs surge forward in staggered lines, engines snarling, ramps locked tight until the last seconds, because the Pacific doesn't do quiet landings. Every island has its own geometry of reefs, shoals, and hidden guns. And Lieutenant J.G. Walter Denison, reassigned after Europe, grips the tiller with a veteran's flat calm as he aims his craft toward a strip of sand where palm trees have already been shredded by naval bombardment. The moment the keel grinds, the ramp crashes down, and men spill out into a humid wall of noise, and for a second, Denison sees the same pattern he saw in France: beach parties directing traffic, engineers clearing lanes, medics pulling wounded back through the ramp's mouth. Only now the backdrop is jungle instead of hedgerows, and the enemy's fire comes from coconut log bunkers and concealed positions rather than concrete casemates. The ramp's purpose doesn't change with geography. It turns a boat into a door fast enough to keep the flow moving. In the Philippines, the flow is enormous. MacArthur's return is theatre and symbolism, but underneath it is supply math, because an army stepping ashore without steady resupply is just a crowd, and the boats keep the crowd fed. The LCVP is joined by its heavier siblings again: LCMS, dropping tanks, LSTs nosing onto beaches and disgorging trucks. Yet the ramped Higgins boat remains the smallest, most numerous piston in the machine, the craft that can run in and out of shallow water all day without needing a dock. And on Leyte and later Luzon, you can see how the ramped landing craft concept has matured into doctrine across services. Naval gunfire and airstrikes smash the edge, boats pour men and gear through multiple lanes, and the beach is turned into a working port in hours rather than days, because the US has learned that speed at the shoreline is survivability for the entire operation. The Japanese, increasingly short on ships and air cover, still try to disrupt the process with artillery, mines, and suicide tactics. But the ramp and repeat system is hard to stop completely once it's rolling, because even if you destroy a boat, another takes its place, and the line doesn't break unless the inventory breaks. Back in New Orleans, the yards have been producing so long that the boats feel like a standard feature of the world. Yet the war's appetite never truly slackens until the last year, and the factories keep sending hulls and ramp assemblies into a pipeline that stretches across oceans. Denison, watching men run down his ramp into Philippine surf, understands in a way only a working sailor can understand. The genius of the Higgins boat isn't that it's perfect. It isn't. It's wet, cramped, vulnerable, and miserable. But that it is adequate, repeatable, and fast, and adequate at scale is what turns strategy into reality. The Pacific's amphibious campaign continues to demand that adequacy again and again. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu earlier, now Leyte and beyond. Each landing requiring an industrial fleet of craft to get ashore over beaches that are often the only option, because harbors are defended or non-existent. And when you leap forward to February 1945 at Iwo Jima, the beach itself is black volcanic ash that swallows boots and bogs vehicles. And yet the ramps keep dropping, because even on the worst beaches, the choice is still unload now or die bottled up. Then April 1945 at Okinawa, where the scale becomes monstrous. Hundreds of ships, waves of craft, days of sustained landings, and the same humble ramped boats shuttle men, ammunition, and wounded under the threat of artillery and later kamikaze attacks on the fleet offshore, proving that the Higgins concept isn't a one-day miracle, but a year-after-year enabler of amphibious persistence. By the time the war closes, the ramp has become so normal that it's easy to forget it had to be invented, argued for, and then manufactured into existence. Yet if you strip away the speeches and the headlines, you keep coming back to the same mechanical truth. A beach assault is a problem of exits, and Higgins gave the Allies an exit that could be reproduced by the tens of thousands. Denison finishes another run, ramp up, engine turning, and he looks back at the shoreline crowded with men and vehicles and realizes it is not only courage that built that scene, it is throughput, the steady conversion of boats into doors and doors into footholds, and the war's amphibious victories in Europe and the Pacific are stitched together by that steady, clanging moment when a ramp drops and the beachhead begins to breathe. August 15th, 1945, New Orleans. The summer heat sits heavy over the yards, and the war news arrives the way it always does in an industrial place, through radios turned up in offices and break areas, through shouted fragments passed down lines where men keep working because their hands don't know how to stop yet. And Lily Mae Broussard stands with a rivet gun hanging idle for the first time in what feels like years, as someone says the words out loud. Japan has accepted surrender terms. Around her, the yard is full of unfinished hulls and stacked ramp assemblies, half-made doors for beaches that will never need to be taken now. And the silence that follows is strange and sharp because it reveals how loud the war has been in this place, even when no one was shooting. In an office, a supervisor flips through contract papers and production schedules with a numb expression, realizing the machine they built will wind down. And in that same moment, the full shape of what they did becomes easier. To see, they didn't build a famous boat, they built capacity, the ability for a nation to land armies over open beaches in numbers and at speed that made enemy fortifications less decisive. Far away, in the memories of coxswains like Walter Denison, the sound that symbolizes that capacity isn't a speech or a gun salute. It's the hard clang of a ramp dropping onto sand, followed by boots and engines and men moving forward because they finally have an exit. Historians will later debate what made D-Day possible: air supremacy, deception plans, code breaking, logistics, naval gunfire. But even the highest commanders recognized the practical hinge. Dwight D. Eisenhower would later say that without Higgins and the landing craft, the Allies could not have landed over an open beach, meaning the entire strategic path to France might have been forced into slower, bloodier alternatives. That statement isn't poetry, it's a soldier's acknowledgement that strategy is limited by what your equipment can physically do, and the bow ramp expanded what was physically possible. The ramp's simplicity hides how radical the idea was in the context of pre-war thinking. Before mass-produced ramped craft, landing troops often meant clambering over sides into surf under fire, unloading vehicles with cranes or onto piers you didn't control, and hoping a harbor survived intact. Higgins and the Marines who pushed for the design turned that into a portable method. Bring your own door, bring your own ramp, turn any suitable beach into a temporary port. And once that method existed at scale, Allied planners could envision operations that would have been fantasy without it: Normandy's open beaches, the island-hopping campaign's constant assaults, the rapid follow-on landings that kept pressure on German and Japanese defenses. In the end, the bold idea wasn't just the ramp, it was the insistence that war could be solved by production as much as by genius. That you could take an amphibious problem and turn it into a repeatable process, and then flood the world with the hardware needed to execute it. Lily May looks out across the yard and sees rows of craft that look plain and functional, and she realizes that plainness is the point. The boats don't need to be admired, they need to work, and they did, from reefs to shingle to volcanic ash. Somewhere in Europe, beaches that were once killing zones are now supply depots, and somewhere in the Pacific, reefs that once trapped boats are now behind airfields and roads. And in both places, the ramp has already done its work, opening a path so larger forces could follow. The war ends, the production lines slow, and the Higgins boat begins its new life as history, but the true legacy remains mechanical and human. A civilian boat builder looked at a deadly bottleneck and built a door that could be manufactured by the tens of thousands. And that door, dropping again and again under fire, helped turn invasions. From desperate gambles into sustained operations. When the last rivet gun finally goes quiet, the yard's workers don't cheer so much as exhale, because they understand, even if they never saw Omaha or Tarawa, that their labor traveled there in the form of ramps that opened into gunfire, and that opened ramps are what made it possible for so many men to step off a boat and onto history.